They say land is just dirt, a commodity, a place to build. For some, it's an investment, a number on a ledger, a blank canvas for development. But for me, for my family, this isn't just land. This is 73 acres of history, of sweat, of sustenance. And at the absolute, beating heart of it all, is this lake. This isn't some man-made reservoir or a golf course water hazard. This is a beautiful, shimmering expanse of natural water, fed by deep underground springs, ringed by ancient cypress and gnarled oaks, a haven for bass, catfish, and every migratory bird that passes through the county. It's been in my family for over a century. My great-grandfather, a man who believed in bending the earth to necessity, not breaking it with greed, dug the original spillway to control its flow. My father taught me to swim in these waters, the cool, dark water shocking the skin on a hot summer day. He taught me to fish for bass by moonlight, telling me the secrets of the water that only generations of ownership can reveal. Every ripple, every lily pad, every shadow cast by the setting sun holds a memory, a piece of our story. It's in my blood. It's in my children's future. It's more than just a body of water on a map. It's an extension of who I am, a sacred trust I hold for the next generation. This lake, and the land that surrounds it, is entirely, unequivocally private property. Our deed is clear. Our boundaries are marked, and the weathered sign near the entrance, private property, nitrogen monoxide trespassing, has stood sentinel against the carelessness of the outside world for decades. So imagine my surprise, my utter disbelief, when Karen showed up. She lives down the road, in one of the newer, sprawling suburban developments, the kind of subdivision where every house looks identical and every lawn is surgically manicured. They built their homes near my lake, drawn by the view and the prestige, but they did not acquire any right to the water itself. She was the self-proclaimed community organizer, as she once introduced herself, a woman with a boundless energy for imposing her will, her vision of order, on anything that did not conform to her aesthetic. The first time she approached me by my lake, she wasn't asking permission. She was issuing directives. I was down by the old fishing pier, mending a tear in the netting, enjoying the quiet solitude that only this place can offer. Then, the silence was shattered by the crunch of expensive loafers on the gravel. She stood there, impeccably dressed, looking like she was about to present at a corporate board meeting, not inspect a working farm's private water supply. She was holding a clipboard, held aloft like a ceremonial scepter, and wearing that expression of stern authority I would come to know and despise. She looked across the water, her gaze sweeping over the natural, healthy growth along the shoreline, the reeds, the native grasses, the very ecosystem that kept the water clean, and wrinkled her nose. She looked at it as if it were an unacceptable flaw, not a necessary part of a thriving, private environment. Mr. Peterson, she began, her voice crisp and authoritative, devoid of any warmth or neighborly courtesy. I'm Karen. I'm part of the Lakeview Homeowners Association Board, the larger community association for everyone who benefits from the lake's aesthetic value. We've received some concerns regarding the maintenance of your section of the lake, particularly the natural growth along the shoreline. We have very clear HOA standards for water clarity and vegetation control that we require all residents to adhere to. My section of the lake. The whole damn thing is my lake. I blinked slowly, trying to process the sheer, stunning audacity of her claim. It was like she was speaking a foreign language, a language based on fabricated authority and suburban delusion. Mum, I replied, trying to maintain my polite composure, the kind of quiet patience that comes from dealing with livestock and weather, but which was now wearing desperately thin. I kept my hands visible, resting them on the wooden pier. With all due respect, I don't know who told you this, but this property, this lake, it is private property. It has no affiliation with the Lakeview Homeowners Association. Your HOA's jurisdiction ends a quarter-mile back, at the edge of your paved development. The water you are standing next to, entirely mine. She just smiled, a tight, dismissive smile that didn't reach her eyes, as if my statement were a charming but irrelevant quirk of the local peasant. Oh, We're all part of the larger Lakeview community here, Mr. Peterson, and common sense dictates that we all contribute to the upkeep of the lake environment, even if it's technically on your property. We have covenants designed to protect the transparency and value of the entire community. Your overgrown shoreline affects everyone's view and property value. She had managed to cram nearly every buzzword of suburban entitlement into 2 sentences. My overgrown shoreline. It was healthy. Native habitat. Affecting property value. My property value was based on the fact that I owned the entire thing, lake included. Free from any HOA tyranny. There are no covenants, I stated firmly, my voice dropping slightly, the authority of the landowner finally overriding the politeness of the neighbor. You do not have jurisdiction here. This conversation is over. She didn't miss a beat. She flipped the clipboard open and scribbled something down, her pen scratching loudly in the sudden silence. Very well, she said, her voice dropping a fraction, the threat now thinly veiled. I'll make a note of your lack of cooperation and adherence to HOA aesthetic standards. We'll be sending over the official guidelines, and perhaps a proposal for a mandatory contribution to our lake maintenance fund to cover the costs of bringing your section into compliance. A mandatory contribution. She wasn't asking for a donation. She was demanding a tax for the use of my own property, under the guise of an authority that did not exist. It was the epitome of entitled people arrogance. I stood there, dumbfounded, watching as she turned on her heel, her designer scarf fluttering, her clipboard held aloft like a symbol of her imagined authority, marching back toward her sleek, black SUV that was idling on my private road. She left me staring at my own lake, suddenly feeling like a stranger on my own land. The sheer audacity was breathtaking. That was the first volley. The first attempt to claim what was mine, to impose HOA rules that didn't exist. It wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a profound violation of my identity, a direct challenge to my legacy. I felt the cold knot of confusion tighten into a fist of cold fury. This wasn't just a simple disagreement between neighbors. This was a sustained, deliberate act of encroachment, a test to see how much of my private sanctuary she could steal by simply claiming she had the authority to do so. I had a feeling that if I let her get away with this first act of invasion, the next thing she would demand was the keys to the farmhouse. This wasn't just about a lake. It was about the fundamental right to be left alone on your own land. And I knew, with chilling certainty, that this woman would not stop until she was stopped, forcefully and unequivocally. The battle for my lake had begun. The initial conversation by the pier was just a polite warning, a flicker of what was to come. Within days, Corinne launched her full-scale assault. It wasn't a skirmish. It was a sustained invasion waged with paper, persistence, and pure, unadulterated entitlement. The paperwork started arriving first. Not official legal summons, mind you, but thick, professionally printed packets delivered right to my mailbox, clearly marked with a fabricated Lakeview Community Association letterhead and stamped with imposing seals she must have ordered online. These weren't friendly suggestions. They were stern, bureaucratic notices of noncompliance. She was attempting to create an HOA jurisdiction simply by declaring it so, fabricating a reality she felt entitled to enforce. The violations she detailed were utterly absurd. The first notice cited lack of aesthetic water clarity. This, for a natural, spring-fed lake with a thriving, healthy ecosystem. She demanded I install industrial filtration systems to achieve the crystal-clear look of a chlorinated suburban pool. The second focused on non-conforming shoreline structures, specifically targeting my old, sturdy wooden fishing pier, which she declared failed the standard for community recreational access. And the third, the one that truly drove the blood to my head, was a direct order to remove unapproved native flora weeds along the bank, meaning the cattails and reeds that were essential filter beds for the water and vital habitat for the bass. She wasn't trying to improve the lake. She was trying to suburbanize it, to sterilize it of its natural, wild beauty, imposing a fake standard of manicured perfection. Each notice came with a financial threat, a calculated fine for noncompliance, and a demand for a mandatory lake maintenance contribution of several $100s a month. This, she explained in a condescending follow-up email, was to cover the costs of outside contractors who would be hired to bring my lake into community standards if I refused to act. She wasn't just demanding compliance, she was demanding tribute. I responded initially with reason, believing the sheer absurdity of her claim would eventually sink in. I sent her copies of my property deed, clearly showing the boundary lines and the singular ownership of the lake. I drafted a polite but firm letter stating that her association had zero legal authority on my land. Her response was telling. She mailed back my deed, highlighted in bright yellow marker, with a handwritten note scrawled across the top. We will consider this technicality once you address the aesthetic issues. Community health comes first. It was the moment I realized her goal was not misguided improvement. It was malicious defiance. She wasn't ignorant of the law. She was contemptuous of it. I immediately brought Marcus, my lawyer, back into the picture. He sent her a formal, certified cease and desist letter, written in the sternest legal language, threatening immediate legal action for harassment, trespass, and malicious nuisance. The letter was refused and returned unopened. Karen was playing a calculated game, using the slowness and formality of the legal system as her shield. She knew that simply by refusing to acknowledge the legal process, she could delay it indefinitely, bleeding me dry financially and psychologically. Then came the physical intrusions, which were far harder to ignore than the paper threats. My peaceful mornings were ruined. I started finding brightly colored Lakeview community flyers stapled over my private property signs, creating a visual lie. Once, I discovered a small, official-looking buoy floating near my fishing pier, marking what she had unilaterally declared a community swim lane. It was subtle. Physical gaslighting, a persistent attempt to normalize her invasion in the minds of anyone who might drive by. The most infuriating trespass, however, involved her vehicle. The SUV, which was once just blocking my road, started appearing at the muddy edge of the lake itself. She would park it there, sometimes for hours, right next to the dilapidated remnants of a community cleanup zone sign she had erected. It wasn't just parking, it was staking a claim. It was her physical representation of public access on my most private ground. I'd walk down there, steaming, and she would be sitting inside, often on a video call, the window rolled down just a crack, ignoring my furious gestures. When I finally got her attention, she dismissed me with that patronizing smile. I'm just utilizing the lake access for a moment, Mr. Peterson. This spot is convenient for supervising the community efforts. The psychological toll was immense. The lake, which had always been my place of refuge, my sanctuary from the demands of the world, was now tainted by her presence. I couldn't walk down there without feeling rage. I couldn't look at the water without seeing the reflection of her black, arrogant machine. I was losing sleep, staring at the ceiling, my mind cycling through futile plans. The legal fees were mounting thousands of dollars for injunctions and filings that wouldn't see a courtroom for months. Every time I called Marcus, he'd offer the same weary advice. We're building the case. Jake, document everything. Don't react. Don't touch her or her car. We have to let the system work. But the system wasn't working. It was grinding slowly, expensively, while she was actively destroying my peace and claiming my legacy. She was using the slowness of justice as a weapon of corruption against a single homeowner whose only crime was wanting to be left alone on his own private property. She had successfully turned my life into a living nightmare of HOA bureaucracy, and the law was powerless to stop the daily, repetitive nature of her violation. When I confronted her one last time, demanding she remove her vehicle and all her garbage from my lake edge, she didn't even put down her phone. She simply looked me up and down, frowned slightly, and said, "Honestly, Mr. Peterson, your agitation is beginning to concern the board members. Perhaps you should consider moving to a community where you are better suited to follow the rules." That was the breaking point. She wasn't just trespassing, she was insulting my way of life and then mocking the law's inability to defend me. I finally understood. There would be no legal resolution quick enough to save my sanity or my land. The system had failed. The law had been outmaneuvered by pure, relentless arrogance. And if my lake was to be mine again, I had to stop waiting for the system to act. I had to enforce the boundary myself. The fight was no longer over property. It was over survival. The cold realization, the one that truly breaks a man's faith in order, is understanding that the law is not built for your kind of immediate, petty conflict. It's built for slow deliberation, for paper trails, for due process that takes weeks to even begin. And Karen, with her relentless, suburban arrogance, understood this loophole perfectly. She had weaponized the system's slowness against my immediate, essential right to peace. The calls to the local sheriff's department had devolved into a weary, embarrassing ritual. The deputies knew my voice. They knew the address. They knew the sleek, black SUV and the exact muddy spot it occupied. Each time, they would arrive, professional and duty-bound, but ultimately impotent. Deputy Miller, the young man who handled most of my calls, would listen patiently, noting my reports of her continued trespass, the new flyers, the bizarre HOA warnings she'd left plastered on my gate. Then, he'd approach her car. Karen was a master manipulator in these confrontations. By the time the deputy arrived, she was never actively doing anything criminal. If she was parked by the road, she'd simply state, "I'm just temporarily stopped, officer." My phone connection was poor, and I was making a very important call to a board member. If she was by the lake, she'd claim she was retrieving a piece of debris or checking on the distressed wildlife. She always played the calm, concerned citizen, positioning herself as the victim of the agitated, rural homeowner. Deputy Miller would return to me, shaking his head. "Mr. Peterson," he'd sigh, his voice sympathetic but firm. "I've issued her 3 formal warnings for trespass, but without a direct, overt criminal act, without her physically damaging property while we are here, or without a specific court order for her removal, my hands are tied." This is technically a civil matter. The very phrase, civil matter, became a mocking refrain, the sound of the law shrugging its shoulders. The police could issue warnings, but they could not enforce my private property rights against her persistent, subtle malice. They could not force her to move her vehicle unless it was obstructing an emergency. To them, a private farmer being blocked from his livelihood wasn't an emergency. It was a nuisance. My only recourse was Marcus, my property lawyer. The legal battle began in earnest, but it was a fight I was forced to wage with my savings. While Karen continued to occupy my land for free, Marcus filed a comprehensive petition for an injunction, a court order that would legally compel her to cease and desist all activity on my property, remove her vehicle, and compensate me for damages. The process, however, was glacial. First came the drafting, the filing fees, the service of process, all paid for out of my farm's operating budget. Then came the waiting for a docket number, waiting for a judge to review the motion, waiting for a hearing date that was scheduled, incredibly, 3 months out. 3 months. 3 months of Karen continuing to treat my private lake as her personal amenity. 3 months of sleepless nights. 3 months of watching the money bleed away. Thousands of dollars poured into paperwork and legal strategy, just to get a court date for a problem that should have been solved in 30 minutes by a tow truck. Karen and her non-existent HOA exploited this delay brilliantly. She would file frivolous, retaliatory counter-complaints, accusing me of harassment and environmental neglect. Marcus had to spend billable hours debunking her absurd claims, meticulously proving that I owned the lake and that her documents were fabricated. The financial cost was staggering, making it clear that the price of seeking justice through the proper channels would likely exceed the value of the civil damages I would eventually win. I was being bled dry, paying dearly for the right to defend what was unequivocally mine. Meanwhile, the harassment escalated, becoming a deliberate, psychological taunt. While we waited for the judge, Karen held a dry run of her community fishing derby on my lake, dropping off trash cans near the shore and leaving behind a laminated sign announcing the official date. I drove past one afternoon and saw her, sitting in a lawn chair next to her SUV, tossing stale bread to the ducks on my water, watching them gorge themselves on food that was disruptive to the lake's ecosystem. She looked up, saw my truck, and offered a casual, victorious smirk. She knew the law was too slow to touch her. She knew she was winning the war of attrition. That image, Karen, calmly desecrating my sanctuary, utterly protected by the slow machinery of justice, became the breaking point. The system had utterly failed me. The police were impotent. My lawyer was stuck in bureaucratic gridlock, and the cost was crushing my family. I was the homeowner, the taxpayer, the victim of relentless entitlement. And yet, I was the one paying thousands and facing months of anguish. While the perpetrator acted with impunity, I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the stack of useless papers, Marcus's expensive letters, the deputy's warning slips, Karen's arrogant HOA notices. The knot in my stomach turned cold and hard. I realized that Karen wasn't fighting for a principle. She was fighting to prove that her will, her manufactured authority, was more powerful than my legitimate property rights. She wanted to force me to surrender my lake, and she was succeeding, not through legal means, but by leveraging the very system that was supposed to protect me. My eyes drifted from the paperwork to the window. The black SUV was still there, a constant, ugly presence by the lake I cherished. And then my gaze shifted to the distant yellow hulk of my digger, sitting silent and massive next to the barn. A different kind of thought, primal and decisive, began to form in my mind. It was a thought that acknowledged a complete failure of civil society to address this blatant corruption of courtesy and law. If the system couldn't protect my property, then the responsibility and the tools fell back to me. The long, frustrating wait for slow justice was over. It was time for immediate, personal retribution. The fight for my lake was about to move from the courtroom to the field. The decision, once made, was not one of rage. The time for blind fury had passed, drowned beneath the endless paperwork and the mocking indifference of the law. This was an act of cold, surgical necessity. It was the only viable solution left when the legal, civil world proved incapable of defending a homeowner against the relentless siege of entitlement. The system had declared itself impotent. Therefore, the responsibility for enforcement defaulted to the man who owned the land. I walked to the barn, every step deliberate. My shadow stretched long across the dewy grass as the sun climbed higher, readying itself for another day of shining on an injustice. I felt an eerie calm, a focus I hadn't known in weeks. There was no shaking of hands, no pounding heart, just the chilling clarity of purpose. I wasn't acting as an emotional homeowner. I was acting as the final, desperate steward of my family's legacy. The digger sat in the morning light, a massive, 20-ton beast of steel and hydraulics, built for shaping the earth, for draining fields, for honest, heavy work. I climbed into the cab. The seat, worn leather and scarred plastic, felt like coming home. I closed the door with a heavy clank. That sound sealed me off from the rest of the world, from the law, from the lawyers, and most importantly, from Karen. I turned the key. The massive diesel engine coughed once, then roared to life with a deep, throaty growl that vibrated through the floorboards and up into my very bones. It was a sound of primal power, utterly unlike the quiet, antiseptic hum of her expensive foreign SUV. I let the engine warm, feeling the controlled potential of the machine beneath me. This wasn't revenge. This was work. This was reclamation. Slowly, deliberately, I drove the yellow Leviathan out of the barn. I followed the rutted, familiar path down toward the lake access point. The contrast, as I approached, was stark, almost comical. The massive, honest machine of the land lumbering toward the small, sleek, arrogant black box that represented everything I despised about the encroaching, entitled world. Her SUV still sat there, positioned precisely at the muddy edge of my private lake, like a stubborn, territorial parasite. The morning sun glinted off its highly polished surface, its tinted windows reflecting the sky, a perfect, impenetrable monument to her defiance. I stopped the digger a few feet from her car. My hand moved to the controls, years of practice guiding the heavy levers. I watched the steel boom extend, massive and powerful. I could feel the tremendous hydraulic pressure building, ready to translate my will into undeniable, destructive force. I positioned the wide, jagged bucket carefully, ensuring a clean lift. This was not about random vandalism. It was about focused, symbolic removal. I intended to destroy the car? Yes, but more importantly, I intended to reclaim the space it occupied. I engaged the hydraulics to lift. The whine of the pumps filled the air, high and insistent. The powerful lip of the bucket slid under the SUV's chassis. The weight transfer began. The metal screamed, a high-pitched, desperate sound of protest as the chassis bent and warped under the focused pressure of 20 tons of steel. The tires popped off the ground. Axles groaned. I heard the sickening sound of snapping metal and shattering glass, not a crash, but a focused, controlled crush. The car was rising, slowly, agonizingly. It lifted into the air. It spun slightly, helpless and fragile, reduced instantly from a symbol of expensive luxury and power to a mere toy in the grasp of the farm machine. Mud, weeds, and lake water dripped from its undercarriage back onto the very ground she had claimed as her own. It was a grotesque, mechanical ballet, and every screech of stressed steel was a sound of release for the weeks of frustration I had endured. I held it there for a moment, suspended between the land and the sky. I looked down at the black SUV, its form utterly distorted. It was no longer a vehicle for transport. It was a sculpture of entitlement defeated. It represented the non-existent HOA jurisdiction, the ignored warnings, the contempt for my boundaries, the police's impotence, and the lawyer's slow, costly calendar. All of it, suspended, waiting for its final sentence. I turned the digger, carefully carrying the dripping, mangled wreckage toward the deepest, murkiest section of my private lake. The very lake she had repeatedly tried to claim for her community. The symbolism was stark, impossible to ignore. The trespasser's vehicle was being returned to the domain she claimed authority over, forever made a part of my private property. I drove the tracks to the water's edge. The ripples spread out ahead of me, greeting the ruined machine. I paused one last time. I wanted to remember this moment, this profound, definitive ending to the siege. Then, slowly, deliberately, I lowered the bucket. The crumpled SUV hit the dark water with a heavy, final whoosh. It was less a splash and more a guttural gulp. The water surged, then settled quickly, swallowing the sound. For a few seconds, there was a violent flurry of bubbles, the last gasp of air escaping the crushed cabin. The car sank quickly, gracefully, like a weary beast returning to the depths. And then, silence, the most profound, chilling silence I had ever heard on my property. It was the sound of a boundary enforced, the visual proof that the law of the owner's will had finally superseded the law of bureaucracy. I sat there in the cab of my digger, watching the ripples fade to stillness. The spot where she had parked was now empty, just disturbed mud. The lake was quiet. There was no elation, no high-fiving celebration, just a cold, heavy sense of completion. I knew, with absolute certainty, that this single, irreversible action would bring a storm of consequences, police, lawyers, media, the like of which I had never seen. But the central, infuriating battle was won. My lake was mine again. And in that moment, as the final bubbles broke on the surface and disappeared, the cost seemed irrelevant. I had defended my sanctuary. The chaos that followed the submergence of Karen's luxury SUV was precisely the chaos I had anticipated, but the reality was far more deafening. Karen's screams were the immediate siren call, but they were quickly joined by the piercing, relentless wail of multiple emergency vehicles converging on my lake. It wasn't just Deputy Miller this time. It was the state police, the sheriff, and even a local news van that, sensing blood in the water, arrived before the tow company. When Karen saw the remnants of her vehicle sinking into the dark, murky waters of my private lake, she didn't just scream. She erupted, hysterical, sobbing, and pointing wildly at me. She demanded immediate, maximum retribution. She had found her ultimate victim status, positioning herself not as a reckless, entitled trespasser, but as the innocent subject of a violent, unhinged attack. They led me away in handcuffs. The cold steel was a stark contrast to the heat of the hydraulic fluid still on my gloves. As I was driven down the access road, I looked back at Mary. She stood on the porch, tears streaming down her face. Yet she nodded once, a single, small nod that said, "I understand." You had to do it. That gesture, that silent acceptance of the consequence, was the only comfort I carried with me to the station. The charges were immediately filed. Felony criminal damage to property. Given the high value of our imported SUV, my lawyer, Marcus, was already waiting at the precinct. He looked grim, but strangely energized. You gave us the evidence, Jake, he murmured, his voice low. Weeks of documentation, ignored warnings, constant trespass. We'll argue extreme provocation and necessity, but this is going to be a brutal, expensive fight. The legal battle became a grueling cycle of court appearances, depositions, and strategy sessions that consumed my life for the next 6 months. Marcus fought the felony charge relentlessly, using every HOA flyer, every recorded phone call to the sheriff, and every photograph of her car parked on my lake access. We argued that Karen's actions constituted a sustained, malicious campaign of psychological harassment that completely subverted the legal process, leaving me with no other viable recourse to protect my home and my livelihood. Eventually, facing the massive mountain of evidence proving Karen's relentless entitlement and disregard for the law, the prosecutor agreed to a plea deal. I pleaded guilty to a lesser charge of misdemeanor property damage. The relief was immense. I avoided jail time, receiving a substantial fine and a lengthy period of probation. My freedom was secured, but the payment had only just begun. The true devastation came with the civil lawsuit. Karen sued me for the full market replacement value of her luxury SUV, plus legal fees and punitive damages. She won. The cost of her vehicle alone, tens of thousands of dollars, wiped out my farm's operating capital and every penny of our family savings. Every cent I had set aside for new equipment, for my children's future, was poured out to compensate a woman for the very destruction she had aggressively engineered. It was the ultimate, bitter irony. I was financially ruined for defending my property, while she, the perpetrator, was made whole. I won the battle for my lake, but I was losing the war for my finances. The final, most painful consequence was unavoidable. To cover the massive civil judgment and the mounting legal bills, Marcus gave us the grim truth: we had to sell a portion of our land. Not just any land, but the 40 acres that bordered the northern edge of my lakeland that had been in my family for over a century. Land that my father had carefully cultivated. Land that held the deepest part of our history. The day the for sale sign went up, hammered into the perfectly green, now meticulously maintained grass near the shoreline, felt like a public execution. I stood with Mary, staring at the sign, feeling the physical pain of loss. We had successfully defended the sanctity of our boundaries, but the cost was an irreversible sacrifice of our legacy. I secured the peace, but I paid for it by selling a piece of my soul, a piece of the very inheritance I had fought so desperately to protect. The lake, now free of Karen's car and her false HOA claims, finally looked peaceful again. But for me, the tranquility was permanently muted by the knowledge of what it cost. I won the fight against entitled people and systemic failure, but the victory was bittersweet. But with the severance of my family's history, I had proved that a man can enforce his boundaries when the law fails him. But I also proved that sometimes, the price of that out defense means tearing a piece of your home down to save the rest. The lake is still mine, but it whispers a constant, quiet reminder that freedom is rarely free, and some battles leave scars far deeper than just the mud on the bank.